There are people in history who leave behind books. There are others who leave behind institutions, empires, monuments. And then there are a very few who leave behind a way of living. Socrates belonged to this last category. He wrote nothing. He founded no school. He had no office. And yet, more than 2000 years later, philosophy still begins with his name. Socrates lived in 5th century BC Athens, a city at the heights of its confidence and on the brink of its collapse. This period is often called the Golden Age of Athens, an era of political innovation, cultural brilliance, and extraordinary intellectual energy. Athens had emerged victorious from the Persian Wars and saw itself as a natural leader of the Greek world. Democracy had taken root in a radical form. Adult male citizens gathered in the assembly, debated laws, voted on war and peace, judged courts, and governed themselves directly. Offices were often assigned by lot, reflecting a deep suspicion of concentrated power. But this democracy rested on exclusions. Women, slaves, and foreign residents, together, the majority of the population had no political voice. Wealth from empires and tributes funded public life, while slavery sustained leisure. Athens was free, proud, argumentative, and deeply unequal. It was also at war. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta would drag on for nearly 3 decades, destroying lives, exhausting resources, and corroding moral certainty. Plague swept through the city, political loyalties fractured, democracy collapsed briefly into oligarchic terror, and was then restored, shaken, and suspicious. This was not a calm world. It was a world asking, often unknowingly, how should one live? Into this restless city was born Socrates, around 470 BC, in the Dame of Alopesh. His father was a stonemason or a sculptor, and his mother a midwife. He came from no aristocratic lineage, inherited no wealth, and showed little interest in advancement. Physically, he was unimpressive by Greek standards, of course, short, broad-nosed, poorly dressed. He went barefoot in all seasons, wore the same cloak year after year, and lived in poverty not by accident but by choice. He married, had children, served as soldier, and fought bravely in war. Those who knew him in battle remembered his calm, endurance, and self-control. Even under hunger, cold, and chaos, he remained steady. But it was in peace, not war, that he unsettled Athens most. Socrates did not teach in schools, he did not lecture, and he did not charge fees. Instead, he wandered through the agora, the gymnasia, the streets. He spoke to politicians, poets, craftsmen, general, and young men. He asked them to question that sounded simple and turned out to be devastating. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? And what is good life? He listened carefully. He accepted their answers, and then quietly he asked again. Slowly, contradictions appeared. Certainties collapsed. Confidence gave way to confusion. This was the Socratic method. Not instruction, but interrogation. Not doctrine, but exposure. He left people in a state that Greeks called aporia. That is, perplexity, productive confusion. Socrates believed that this was not cruelty, but care. Because a life built on unexamined assumptions, he thought, was a life already lost. A story preserved by Plato tells us that a friend of Socrates once asked Oracle at Delphi whether anyone was wiser than him. The oracle replied, no one. Socrates was disturbed by this. He did not feel wise. So he began questioning those reputed to possess wisdom, statesmen, poets, and experts. What he discovered was not knowledge, but confidence without understanding. And from this, he drew a paradoxical conclusion. His wisdom lay in knowing that he did not know. This was not false humility, it was a philosophical stance. Socrates believed that false certainty was more dangerous than ignorance because it closed the doors to learning and moral growth. Unlike earlier Greek thinkers who speculated about nature of the universe, Socrates turned philosophy towards ethics. His central conviction was radical. An unexamined life is not worth living. Virtue is knowledge. Care of the soul that matters more than wealth, power, or reputation. True happiness, that is eudaimonia, comes from moral integrity, not pleasure or success. He believed philosophy was not an academic pursuit, but a moral duty. To question oneself and others was a care of the soul. He also spoke of divine inner voice, that is, daimonion, that warned him against wrongdoing. For Socrates, reason and piety were not opposed, they worked together. Socrates lived through Athens, defeat, humiliation, and political trauma. After the war, the city was anxious, fragile, eager for stability, and Socrates was the opposite of reassuring. He embarrassed powerful men, he challenged democratic opinions, he associated with controversial figures, and he refused to flatter the city or affirm its innocence. In 399 BC, he was charged with impiety and corrupting the youth. The charges were thin, the fear was real. At his trial, Socrates refused to beg for mercy. He insisted that silencing philosophy would harm Athens more than his death. He said he would rather die than give up questioning. The jury convicted him by a narrow margin. Socrates was offered escape. He refused. To flee, he argued, would be to answer injustice with injustice. One must not destroy the laws simply because they have failed you. Surrounded by his friends, he drank hemlock calmly. His final hours were spent discussing the soul, reason, and death, not as a tragedy, but as a release. His last recorded words were simple. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not forget. A sacrifice of thanks to the god of healing. And if death itself was a cure, then why not? Socrates left no writings. What he left was an example. He showed that thinking is a moral act. Questioning authority is a civic responsibility. Integrity may cost one's life. Philosophy is not about having answers, but about living honestly with questions. Every tradition of Western thought, ethical, political, philosophical, passes through him. Through Plato, through Aristotle, through centuries of disagreements and reinterpretation. But at the center remains a man walking through Athens, stopping strangers, asking gently, "What do you mean?" And "Are you sure?" The question still follows. Okay, so why does he still matter? Or maybe, does he still matter? More than 1,000 years have passed since Socrates drank the hemlock. Empires have risen and collapsed. Religions have transformed moral imagination. Sciences have remade our understanding of the world, and technologies have altered the conditions of human life. And yet, Socrates remains disturbingly contemporary. This persistence is not accidental. Socrates mattered because he did not give humanity a doctrine. He gave it a method, a posture, and a moral demand, and those who do not expire. We live in an age saturated with information and yet starved of wisdom. Socrates anticipated this condition. His central warning that people often confuse confidence with knowledge speaks directly to modern life. Expertise is claimed loudly, opinions circulate rapidly, and certainty is rewarded more than understanding. Socrates would have recognized this instantly. His insistence on defining terms, examining assumptions, and admitting ignorance is corrective to intellectual arrogance. In classrooms, media, politics, and public discourse, the Socratic attitude remains the most reliable defense against misinformation and shallow thinking. To think Socratically today is to ask, what do you mean by that? How do you know this is true? What follows if we accept this claim? These questions are timeless. Modern education emphasizes skills, credentials, and outcomes. Socrates offers a different model. For him, education was not transmission of information, but the formation of character. He did not lecture, he questioned. He did not instruct, he provoked. This approach remains foundational to the critical pedagogy, legal education, ethical training, liberal arts, and traditions. Socratic teaching respects the learner as a rational agent. It assumes that understanding cannot be poured into the mind, it must be drawn out. In a world increasingly driven by automation and standardized testing, Socrates reminds us that education, at its core, is a moral endeavor. Socrates forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Democracies do not automatically protect truth tellers. Athens was proud of its freedom, and yet it executed the man who questioned it most honestly. This lesson resonates today. Socrates represents the figure of ethical dissent, the citizen who refuses to flatter power, who exposes incoherence, who insists that authority justify itself rationally. He showed that loyalty to the society does not mean silence. In fact, genuine loyalty may require discomfort, critique, and resistance. The price of such integrity can be high. Socrates paid with his life. Socrates' refusal to escape prison remains one of the most debated moments in moral philosophy. He teaches us that moral life involves tragic choices, situations where no option is painless. But he also insists on this principle: it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. In an age of moral compromise, rationalization, and ethical shortcuts, this position feels almost unbearable in its rigor, and yet it offers a standard against which actions can be measured. Socrates reminds us that integrity is not situational. Socrates' daimonion, the inner moral warning, can be understood today not as mysticism, but as conscience shaped by reflection. He trusted an inner moral awareness, refined through constant self-examination. In a noisy world, Socrates invites us inward, to pause, to listen, and to ask whether actions align with our deepest value. This inward turn is not escapism, it is preparation for responsible action. Perhaps Socrates' greatest legacy is that philosophy is not merely something one studies, it is something one practices. To live Socratically is to resist unexamined belief, accept intellectual discomfort, value truth over reputation, care for the soul more than status. This is demanding, but it is also liberating. Socrates did not leave behind institutions. He did not found a school. He did not write a book. He left behind an example, a man who questioned in public, who lived simply, who refused to lie to himself or others, who chose death rather than abandoning philosophy. That choice is why he is still talked about. The unexamined life, Socrates said, is not worth living. But the examined life is not easy. It demands courage, humility, and honesty, qualities that are rare now, as they were in ancient Athens. This is why Socrates is not safely in the past. He stands beside us, questioning. In every mind that doubts itself, in every voice that asks why, he walks the agora again, barefoot, unafraid, where questions rise and myths are tried, where minds won't kneel, through time, through fear, through tides, untides. Socrates has not died.